so I hope that's all right. Welcome to this lunchtime event looking at how the humanities research can contribute to policy. My name is Ben Rogers and I'm Professor of Practice London at the University of London. I'm also at the LSE Cities, where I work on European cities. So I'm a sort of urbanist and a bit of a London geek, and I guess a sort of professional. And the background to this event is the London Research and Policy Partnership. We've given a presentation and talked about this initiative at this event, at this forum already. But for those of you who don't know, that's a relatively new partnership which brings together the academic research community and policymakers and London government to address London's most critical challenges. We launched it a bit more than a year ago. We're working very closely with the intelligence unit at the GLA, with London councils, and with the universities. This extraordinary sort of wealth of academic expertise that we have across London, which we feel can do so much to help address our problems, and particularly in a context where local authorities and public sector is facing huge budgetary pressures, and there is a sort of growing support from the academic policymakers and funders for more engagement between experts, between academic experts, between universities and the real world, and in particular policymakers. So we feel that the sort of direction of travel in many ways is supportive of what we're trying to do. But I've been very conscious throughout that when we talk about academic expertise, again and again we end up drawing on working with social scientists. And I'm sure many of you in the policy world probably have a sort of social science background. You'll be sort of an economist or done political science or sociology or public health, those sorts of things. And as I say, I think it's really important that we draw on all that the humanities have to offer us as well. That's particularly perhaps important for the University of London and the School of Advanced Studies, which is where I'm based, which is the National Centre for Humanities Research. I could talk a bit about why what humanities have to offer, but in fact, I'm going to ask Joe Fox to do that, who's our first speaker. But first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Noel and to colleagues from the London Policy and Strategy Network for hosting this event and helping us organise it. This is exactly the sort of audience that we want to reach through LRAP. The way this is going to work is we've got 3 speakers. We've got an hour, so time will be tight. We're first going to hear from Professor Joe Fox, who's Pro Vice Chancellor for Research and Engagement at the University of London and Dean of the School for Advanced Study in Senate House. And Joe's going to talk more generally about relations between the humanities and policy. We're then going to hear from Professor Pascal Eibischer on the pandemic and what humanities can do or did do or could have done to help us navigate our way through the pandemic. And lastly, Justin Colson, who's Senior Lecturer at the Institute of Historical Research at the School of Advanced Studies, who's going to be talking about history and place. So I think, as I said, I think we've asked each speaker to speak for 10 minutes. If everyone speaks more or less the time, that should give us a good 20 minutes at the end to take questions. If you want to, I'm certainly not going to go around the virtual table and ask everyone to introduce themselves, but if you'd like to use the chat just to say who you are, what your interest is, that would be absolutely great. And if you want to start posting questions or comments, please do. Joe, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to talk at today's event. Just to say a few words, first of all, about the school to give some context. Well, the school provides UK-wide resources and services for arts and humanities research communities, and we do that to foster innovation and research into critical social issues. And what we do is that we support knowledge-based networks in humanities disciplines, in digital humanities, and we support thousands of events every year and provide resources which catalyse UK-wide collaborative projects in the humanities. So that focus on humanities research is critical to understanding and addressing societal issues means that a lot of our work stands at the intersection between scholarship and policy and often blurs the boundaries between them. And I think it's obvious in what Ben has already said, but anyone who works in the arts and humanities, that we don't always read as much as we should or see as much as we should about the contribution of arts and humanities research to informed policy making. Well, that's not an indication of the extent or importance of the rich collaborations that exist between researchers and policymakers. And even the most cursory scan of the findings of the recent Research Excellence Framework exercise, which measures the impact of research in the UK, uncovers significant contributions to policy from arts and humanities researchers, perhaps in areas that we might not expect, from health and well-being to climate change, from social justice to heritage and the arts, from innovation in concert with industry to community and building and placemaking. And we'll hear some of those things come up as we discuss these issues today. The reach of arts and humanities research with policy engagement is wide. The interactions with other disciplines and other sectors are deep, and the outcomes are transformative. So what can humanities research bring to policy? Well, as the ref demonstrated, the variety of contribution is really quite striking. But I'm going to highlight some of the more obvious ways in which arts and humanities researchers have collaborated with policymakers recently and over the years. Well, policy, as you all know, often involves a consideration of ethical issues. The use of AI is an obvious one. Decisions over healthcare options, the cultivation of GM crops, military tactics, how to tackle disinformation while maintaining a commitment to freedom of speech. And that's my own area of research. Well, humanities researchers, as I have done, as many colleagues have done, are often called upon by policymakers to work through some of the ethical implications of policy options, policy decisions, and how, in particular, to engage the public in these debates and decisions. Participatory research is now a major element of what arts and humanities researchers bring and how to involve the public in both the research that we do, but also how to involve the public in policy decisions that are being taken and to consider those wide ethical implications. Well, arts and humanities researchers have particular expertise in negotiating those spaces. Humanities researchers can also help to navigate the complex and continuing controversies around the rights and responsibilities of citizens that directly affect how we govern at a local, national and international level. And a lot of research goes on around what citizenship means and how engaged citizenship works and how it intersects with local policy, how it intersects with international policy. Historians, as a historian, I'm bound to talk about this a little bit, so I hope you'll indulge me, but historians have consistently been consulted by policymakers wishing to avoid mistakes in policy or in policy implementation. And the examples here are actually really quite numerous, but are prevalent, particularly in foreign policy, in defence, in social policy, economic policy. The current governor of the Bank of England has a PhD, for example, in economic history, and more recently in healthcare. And Pascal will talk a little bit about this later, I'm sure, looking at past pandemics and vaccine hesitancy. And interestingly too, historians have also assisted institutions in providing a new kind of institutional memory to counter the effects of high staff turnover in a fast changing environment. In particular, if you think about the churn in government departments, and you lose a lot of that institutional memory that often contributes to sound policy making. Well, historians have been using their skills more recently in helping government departments in Whitehall to navigate some of those challenges. And our own history and policy unit based at the Institute of Historical Research, for example, is active in this area, and they help to train researchers to work with policymakers in ways that policymakers find helpful. So starting with the policymaker's problem and working from there rather than the researcher's own research. It can work both ways, of course. And of course, they bring together a UK-wide network of researchers working in a wide range of areas that policymakers can call upon. So the policy unit has often facilitated numerous conversations with people reaching out from various policymaking bodies to say, I need an expert in X, and they can find that person who they know will work well with policymakers. But arts and humanities researchers can also be involved in really creative solutions to societal challenges. And I have been reading through all of these impact case studies from the Research Excellence Framework, and I've been particularly struck by some really moving examples. And I just want to sort of give one or two from that reading that I hope might indicate the kinds of work that arts and humanities researchers can do that perhaps we don't necessarily think of. And just one really unexpected one for me. It's not necessarily a policy, but it does indicate how creative arts and humanities researchers can be. And I want to use the example of Hug. And Hug is a device. It looks a bit like a doll, and it has a kind of soft, tactile body, weighted arms that can hug a person, wrap around a person to give the sensation of both giving and receiving a hug. And inside the doll is an electronic device that replicates a heartbeat, and it can also be programmed to play a personal list of sounds. Well, they've been used with dementia patients, actually, to give comfort to dementia patients. Please do look it up online. The films and testimonies are really very moving. A recent Welsh government funded research council, this is a Welsh-based project at Cardiff Met. The Welsh government looked at research to see how effective the hug was, and it found that people living with dementia who used a hug for 6 months had an 87% increase in their well-being and improved cognitive and functional ability. And they also reduced agitation and enhanced social interaction that was created by a team from Cardiff Met School of Art and Design. So arts and humanities researchers having a really profound impact on the lives of many. And that creative solution finding also translates in how the arts can reach deep into communities and start to really deliver in practical ways the regeneration, for example, of the high street. And another example is from the University of Huddersfield, whose researchers worked with a team at Kirklees Council to populate 40 former retail units with a 2-year programme of events and activities. And it brought the town's high street back to life. And that initiative then formed a part of the Huddersfield Blueprint Regeneration Plan and their post-COVID roadmap to recovery. You'll all be aware, of course, of the impact of different cultural norms and how they can influence policy choices and how policies land. And much humanities research provides a deep understanding of cultures and perspective. And in particular, arts and humanities build trusted relationships, particularly with hard to reach communities, helping to contextualize some of how policies work, how devise the policies, but also how they land in communities. But I think above all, humanities research can provide insight into what it means to achieve well-being, whether individually or collectively in a complex world. And researchers can advise, again, often creatively and from a deep evidence base, as to the kinds of policies that would help to enable this. And I think it's for all of these reasons that arts and humanities research is seen by key bodies, funding bodies and partners as being part of the solution to the big, broad challenges we face at all levels, local, national, international, and why interdisciplinary working is critical to those solutions. For example, climate scientists now regularly work with humanities scholars to understand how to encourage the human behaviours that will make change possible. But it also, arts and humanities research also helps to understand how to implement green policies in a fair and just way. For example, the Climate Just project at the University of Manchester looked at how climate change has disproportionately affected vulnerable groups, and their work has been used from policymakers from Hull and Clydesdale to Helsinki. So I think I've only got a few minutes to talk to you today, but I think I've touched on some of the things already done. It's far greater and far more capacious than I've been able to do justice to today. But I hope that some of the possibilities and potentials is clear. And I'm going to hand over to the real experts in this field, which are Pascal and Justin, who'll be able to give you a much more tangible sense of what all of this means than I can. But thank you very much for inviting me to introduce today's event.
Joe, that was absolutely brilliant. I'm so pleased I didn't try and encapsulate the contribution that humanities can make to policy, because it would have been very, I would have shown myself up if you'd followed up with that. That was wonderful. But as you were sort of talking, I was just really reflecting on, outside of sort of work context, how much of our lives are just spent, in the humanities, whether we're reading novels or watching films or talking with our friends about the wrongs and rights of this or that, policy or leader, and yet how relatively little these do feature in our professional lives. And perhaps that is, just an indication that things really aren't quite right, or the richness that humanities can bring. Right, over to our next speaker is Professor Pascal Aebischer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and who is Professor of Shakespeare and Early Modern Performance Studies at the University of Exeter. And Pascal is going to talk to us about work she's been doing. Well, I'll leave you to introduce it on COVID and the humanities. Pascal.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. It's a very hard act to follow, Joe. And I think she's done just a fabulous job actually showing the whole breadth of what arts and humanities can do. Now, I'm going to dive into what arts and humanities have done specifically during the pandemic, because I'm the lead investigator of the Pandemic and Beyond, which is a team based at the University of Exeter. So we're funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council until February 2023 to coordinate their COVID-19 research portfolio of 77 rapid response projects. The portfolio of projects focus principally on the UK, and they contribute to understanding the urgent problems that were created or exacerbated by the pandemic and by contagion mitigation measures. And they also explore practical solutions to those problems. So I'm both the lead of the Pandemic and Beyond project, but also the lead researcher of one of the 77 COVID projects, as is Joe, by the way. My background, as you heard, is in Shakespeare and performance studies, and that sounds like it's worlds apart from COVID. But the work that I've been doing on digital broadcasting over the past decade put me in the right place when lockdown struck, and lots of creative industries professionals had to pivot to digital right away to think about how we could pivot to digital modes of delivery and investigate how theatre companies in particular could do so most successfully. So my initial focus was entirely on theatre practitioners, for whom I produced a digital toolkit along with employment guidelines for home working. But my Pandemic and Beyond role then meant that I became aware of how my own work might actually be relevant to policymakers beyond the theatre industry. So I ended up talking to DCMS about the way that taxation was disincentivizing digital theatre, even though there are clear carbon benefits to going digital, and I talked to the POST people, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, when they were consulting about a post note on flexible working practices. And while I was talking to them, I sort of drew their attention to the need to think about digital and analog innovation and how that might help resilience in the creative industries. That in turn led to a second post note being commissioned on the impact of digital technology on arts and culture in the UK. And that one drew evidence not just from my own project, but that of several other projects in the portfolio. So there's a snowballing effect there. And it turns out that this was the first post note ever to focus specifically on the arts and culture sector. And that was a really exciting development for the post note author. So I'm telling you about this personal journey from isolated Shakespeare scholar to someone who's actively seeking to bring insights from my research to the attention of policymakers, because it shows so clearly that knowledge and understanding relevant to decision making can come from quite unusual sources and can surprise the people who are providing that evidence themselves. So part of my job for Pandemic and Beyond is to work with academics that I'm looking after to help them make that journey as well, and show them how, why, and where their research might be most relevant to decision making. And that is one of the big challenges that we encountered. What was the sheer amount of inexperience amongst colleagues when engaging with policymakers. So I've worked with colleagues at Policy at Exeter and external consultants such as Culture Commons to help academics translate their research findings into sharp and targeted recommendations that are evidence-based and that can be easily understood by non-subject specialists and then acted on. That is a really difficult thing for us to get right as academics. And it's important to understand that for us, this is all new. It doesn't come quite naturally. It's not something that is part of our training. And it's also sort of made difficult for us to think about by the systematic favouring of STEM subjects by the current government and the attacks on experts that have really undermined our ability to contribute in this area. But our hope is that our work during the pandemic is going to shift this, that it's going to change the narrative. And I've got a quote from one of our researchers, and this is where I'm going to struggle with screen sharing. Let me just try and get this right. Here we go. So they said, this research has been a game changer. It has shown that academic researchers can be incredibly agile and generous in sharing their findings. Most significantly for us, it has radically shifted the ways in which we engage with policymakers, and it's developed some very strong long-term relationships across the UK. Now, the other part of my job is why I'm here today. It's about engaging with decision makers to share our work with you and to make the case for why arts and humanities expertise will help you make stronger decisions because of the types of evidence and the forms of knowledge that researchers in these areas are able to bring to the table. So on our website, you will find a policy hub on which the research in our portfolio is organised into 9 broad policy themes. I hope that the link to that hub will go into the chat. Now, if you look through the tabs, you'll find over 50 evidence-based policy briefs. So please look at those, because I'm sure that you'll find ideas that are relevant to your work. Now, what we found when we were creating this hub is that arts and humanities research draws on rigorous theoretical and ethical thinking, just as Joe said, that frames research is often creative, community-based, and that involves precisely the parts of the population that are often described as hard to reach. And this means that the sample sizes of our research are often dismissed within a STEM context, but we actually take a different approach because the individual and small groups are really important to us, and we place close attention to contexts and to the experience of human beings, to their histories and how those histories impact on their perceptions of the problems that they face. And this allows us to contribute crucial and really nuanced insights into how policy decisions affect the lives of not just the broader population, but also of those more marginalized individuals and communities. And it models how we can involve people in making big, impactful decisions and get those right for everyone. So I'm thinking here, for example, of the work of the UK Pandemic Ethics Accelerator that harnessed the expertise of citizen juries to rapidly integrate ethical thinking into policy making, or of the team working on cultural translation among London's migrant communities that found out why different migrant communities were reacting in different ways to public health messaging, and were sort of baffling policymakers. And they've been able to advise on how to adapt messages to particular population segments. Another example is the Stay Home Stories project that looked at how families were adapting their homes during lockdown. And they've been able to track changes in attitude towards the built and the natural environment. And those things have relevance for planning, but also for the prevention of violence in the home. Now, when it comes to deciding how to approach legislation that will determine both life and quality of life for the most vulnerable who can't speak for themselves, nothing beats the insight and expertise of someone who's been working with a group of diverse care home residents living with dementia, involving them and their carers in arts activities, or the team who've been running online workshops with care home workers to help them interpret government guidance. And so these researchers really understand the problems faced by frontline workers, and they can offer a big picture view that stays true to the individual experience as well. But arts and humanities isn't just about working with people in this way. It's also about using analytical and large data crunching methodologies to figure out what the broad population thinks and how to adapt difficult messages so that they target various population segments effectively. Linguists have crunched vast amounts of social media data to see how people have responded to public health messages, and they've been able to advise on how and why conspiracy theories spread, while historians like Joe have been able to demonstrate that those stories have a long history and they can advise on what that history teaches us for the future. So I'll end with the words of one of our researchers. They said in the survey we conducted this summer, "I believe that what has been evident across our COVID-19 research projects is that arts-based research methods and approaches can generate much more nuanced narratives, capture the complex experiences and engage people that wouldn't otherwise find research accessible. Whilst of course medical research in such a crisis is fundamental, so too is understanding different people's experiences, responses, and how their lives have been impacted so that we can make more effective policies and support people's recovery and resilience looking forward." So I hope you'll have the time to have a look at our policy hub, and that looking forward you will proactively seek out those shy arts and humanities researchers when faced with a big policy question, because the hope is that you will work with us so that we can investigate the research questions that will help you make the decisions that affect us all in our complexity as human beings. And thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. And I should say a special thank you to Pascal, who I know has interrupted a day of walking on Dartmoor to be with us today. I mean, the weather's probably not great for walking, but I mean, it's always raining in Dartmoor, so there you go. But thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Before we turn to our final speaker, can I just prompt people to either put questions in the chat or put your hand up once we turn to the questions and answers session. And I'm particularly keen to hear from policymakers, and it's been a bit, we did try and find some policymakers who can talk about the other side of the relationship. But if people who've had experience, policymakers have had experience working with humanities researchers who've got sort of doubts or concerns or questions about why they might not want to do that or have worries about it, please don't be shy. But I'm going to turn now to our final speaker, Justin Colson, who is, as I said, Senior Lecturer at the Institute of Historical Research at the School of Advanced Studies in the University of London in Senate House. And the Institute of Historical Research has had a long history of working particularly on London or on London's history. And I'm guessing the work that Justin's going to be talking about has been informed by that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. Hopefully get my PowerPoint. People can see the presentation itself, hopefully. So yeah, I'm based in the IHR, but I'm specifically based in the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, which, as Ben says, picks up that long heritage of both London history, but also regional and local history throughout England and Wales. We're there to foster engaged, innovative research into placed histories across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban and from the parish to the metropolis, with an emphasis on localised, micro-historical and site-specific. And I think the example, I'm going to be giving a much more detailed example, a case study of one project here, but I think it'll be really pulling out the same themes of reaching hard-to-reach groups and really focusing on meaning and experience that Pascal was discussing just now. So really focusing on the ways that these kind of localized approaches to history are powerful tools in placemaking and in catalyzing engagement. And as we sometimes have to remind first-year undergraduate students, history is not the past, but history is the process of creating meaning about the past and creating meanings about people and about places, which is exactly what we do in placemaking, of course. So I'm using the example of the Layers of London project as my case study. And just to give an example, these are some of the policy-focused organisations and projects that we worked with during that project. I've literally just left early from a workshop run by the Mayor of London's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm and their London Unseen programme, where we are workshopping precisely these issues about inclusion and community-led practice. So to explain the project itself, Layers of London was a Heritage Lottery Fund project funded with around £1 million of funding between 2017 and 2020. It aimed to uncover, record and share multiple overlapping histories of London. It aimed to digitise historic maps and data, but more importantly, preserve and share heritage as a crowdsourced record of urban change. And by capturing the histories of different communities and their overlapping in the space of London, foster a dialogue between those communities, as well as between London's past, present and future. Project, as I say, is still running. The IHR is committed to fund it for another 5 years in its maintenance phase, but we have delivered the core product here, the record, Layers of London website, layersoflondon.org. We've got something like 14,000 memories, photographs, etc. People have contributed more than 400 maps. And you can see just here from the homepage some of the areas of focus that we use in the website. But I think the main things we're going to talk about here are the role of co-production and the work we've done with communities as part of this project. So obviously co-production is a key goal in placemaking and policy making, and humanities researchers are uniquely skilled in fostering that kind of engagement and co-production, as Pascal was also touching upon. Layers of London explicitly set out not to impose solutions for heritage onto communities, but to engage those communities in processes of co-production. So in addition to things like running dozens of workshops, the team sought to partner with community groups and existing projects to help them showcase their work. And some of those partnerships have become really strong and self-sustaining moving forward. Productive partnerships have grown organically from the work. We've done an awful lot of work now with the organisation Everyday Muslim, who are helping to curate the London Unseen programme for the Mayor's Commission for Diversity. And we've gone on to support them with paid internships to support their work. So by doing this, we're not only engaging underrepresented groups to help make their histories visible, but we're providing an infrastructure for community memory and an infrastructure that's shared between communities. So understanding of the public realm has obviously expanded from the idea of just being purely physical material to something much more hybrid, involving digital layers, interventions, and practices. Strategies for catalysing participation can therefore work from the ground up, and what better way to do that than with a map? So placemaking through heritage activities, and especially heritage mapping, opens up those connections between communities. And here you can see, I think, one of my favourite parts of a piece of work that we did in this project, Camberwell Chalk Map, where we asked children in their community to represent their understanding of their area. We then turned that into another overlay, another layer on the map, allowing other communities to then mark that up with even more information. So recording and amplifying diverse voices through means like this literally puts them on the map, and I've said connects the different organisations and different communities with each other. And to do this, we've been engaging with policymakers and placemakers from the beginning. Some concrete examples we've worked with recently include Barking and Dagenham Council. As part of the Barking Riverside development, we've been working their placemaking team, linking new places they might seem to the deeper histories of that locality, using information from the website, using internships that we've sponsored, as well as the work that I just mentioned from the Mayor's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, the Untitled London season, which is producing historical tours organised and led by members of communities throughout the city, which we're then capturing and creating a memory of through the website. So to sum up, what we're looking at here is the practice of history as an ideal way of facilitating participatory placemaking, spanning the digital and the physical. And I think looking at the evaluation report from the end of the project here shows just how successful the project was in those ways. I found out about unfamiliar aspects of London's heritage, more than about 75% agreeing with that. Intriguing that learning about my local area has made me feel proud of where I live is the least successful, and that's perhaps something to explore further. But I just want to conclude by pointing out that working on the history of places in the way that we've been doing here offers the chance to embed, empower, and co-create with local communities rather than imposing solutions upon them. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. As you were talking, Justin, I remember being at a conference with a leader of a East London local authority. This was some time ago, and he was sort of making a pitch for his borough to various sort of investors and developers, and he said, West London is the history of London, and East London is the future of London, and we're not held back by our history. And I remember thinking, oh, I hope this is not going to this is not the way that this borough is going to go. And it says so much about his approach to development, because of course East London is extraordinarily sort of rich in history, and I'm afraid some of the development that happened under his watch, does rather suggest the limitations of, or the dangers, I think, in just developing London without any sense of where it's come from, or the histories of the communities that make it up. Right, we've got a few questions, so I'm going to just read those out. So we've got one from Jenny Hassan first. How valuable has it been to develop research projects with the potential for open dynamic questions relating to relevant policy areas? And then one from Noel, and I've got one as well, but where do ideas for research projects come from? Is there a way that local authorities can see emerging themes that university departments are considering? I think that's, perhaps that more concrete question, we should begin with that. How does this relationship work best? Is it a case of policymakers struggling with something and turning to researchers? Is it a case of policymakers sort of finding out what researchers are interested in and working on and going to them? And indeed, how would you find out if you were a policymaker, what sort of humanities resources and expertise might be available to you? I mean, I don't know, Joe. I'll start with you, but if anyone else wants to contribute.
So I think, starting with that idea of, where do ideas for research projects come from? Well, sometimes they come from the researchers themselves who are thinking about, well, what do they want to do next? But now, quite often, they're coming from collaborative relationships. So it's fora like LRAP and others that are able to bring researchers together with policymakers at an early stage, so that the projects themselves are being formed in concert with policymakers. So rather than it used to be a sort of an old sort of cliche in a way that the researcher would come up with a project and then approach policymakers. And this sort of touches on the question from Titus Alexander as well about how do you make sure that communities are actually involved and that this is actually benefiting the community. It's because the design of the project itself now are done in concert together, so that the outcomes for all are aligned. And it really does make for a more exciting proposition as a researcher, because the interactions and perspectives you get are totally different, and it transforms the way that you think and that you research. But there are different fora in which you can explore these things. And I think for me, one of the best ways of doing that are through projects like Pascal's, where just bringing together the researchers. So there's a big body of researchers. There's a hub where you can come together and understand how you can collaborate, or things like LRAP, which are bringing researchers from lots of different disciplines, interdisciplinary researchers together to focus on particular policy issues. So what we need are these fora to make sure that the projects are clear and surfaced, and most importantly, that they're conceived of and designed together. And I think that's how research is really going now.
Great. Justin or Pascal, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean, just to reinforce what Joe was saying there about the value of hubs. So I would advise policymakers, if they're thinking about it's a problem that they'd like to investigate, it's find the hubs. So the pandemic and beyond, until February, we're going to be very active. If you look at our resources and then you get in touch with us, we can broker an introduction to the right research team that has some expertise in this area already. You could approach the various policy engagement teams at the various universities. So just speaking from my own university, obviously I'm not in London, but Policy at Exeter would be able to think through who they know, who is on their books from within the university that can speak to the problems that you are facing and might be able to work with you, and they can broker introductions. Now, the hope is that we will at some point have a national policy hub that will allow us to do this work for everybody, so that there's a one-stop shop for policymakers. But until then, you will have to go to the various different places. I see that there is also a question about the value for academic, for the communities that are involved in academic research. And I think that's such a key question, because that is, again, one of the ways in which arts and humanities is different from other subject areas, because very often, or most often, arts and humanities researchers don't take exploitative or extractive approaches when they are working with communities. It is often in the policy engagement and the policy thinking and recommendations and findings come out of an activity that is directly for the benefit of the community. So it will be people who are doing arts-based activities with dementia patients who will be then able to be frontline rapporteurs about what is happening in care homes. It's the people who are working with prisoners doing a reading project who will be able to tell you about the conditions in prisons. So it's the communities are directly benefiting from the research. So it's really worth engaging specifically with arts and humanities researchers, because they're most likely to be able to add value to both sides, both the policymakers, but also the communities in question. So I'm really, really passionate about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, just add, kind of the session I've just come from, I've seen some amazing examples of best practice coming from East London, which might not have history according to some, but some amazing things there. Queen Mary have got what they call a Civic Champions Network, which they seem to use in a similar kind of way, and they've from that fostered quite a broad range of collaborative doctoral awards with some of the community organisations they've worked with, involving practitioners and giving practitioners the chance to go on and do research through funded PhD schemes and things like that. So different universities still have slightly different slants and approaches on this, but there's some amazing best practice out there when you can find it.
Brilliant. If I can just say a word about LRAP, London Research and Policy Partnership. I mean, our first priority is to create a brokerage scheme for that'll match policymakers and academic researchers in London. And we're lucky enough to have 2 CAPE-funded policy fellows who are seconded into the GLA from UCL and have been helping us with research. What policymakers and researchers would want from a brokerage system, and then think about how we would design one. So you'll be hearing more about that shortly. If I could just ask a question to our speakers in particular, I mean, I'm sure you know the sort of pressures that most public policymakers and sort of officers in local government are under. How do we and I guess the worry might be, well, this sounds all great, but also sounds like it's going to take up a lot of my time, and I might be led down some sort of some very academic avenues. And I'm just going to get on with it. I'm just going to do it anyway. I'm just going to commission the public realm, intervention, or I'm just going to do the refugee centre or whatever it is. How can we persuade our policy colleagues that actually this is really helpful and won't make extra demands on them? And I guess also, I mean, are there, and perhaps this is one for any of you, are there resources that we can, I'm thinking about sort of placements, or I mean, what sort of practical help might be out there in terms of sort of resourcing these sorts of partnerships and collaborations?
Do you want me to jump in? Yeah. Okay. So I think it comes down to, in terms of resources, there are often, we apply for grants and pots of money all the time to do exactly this kind of work. And particularly universities receive funding directly to promote knowledge exchange. And these are pots of money that are geared towards bringing researchers and practitioners, policy professionals, or whatever, arts collaborative performing, whatever it is, external organizations together. And it helps to build projects. So there are resources, even if you just start with the universities. Other organizations have their own, policy pots as well to draw on. When you start combining those funds, that then starts to really build up some good resource and capacity to be able to deliver projects. So resources are there. It's just about trying to sort of locate them in the individual universities, coming up with the project. What do you want to do together? And I think that I can sort of see where you're coming from, Ben, when you think about, look, everybody I think is under pressure. However, the ways in which researchers now work with policymakers is very different. They're very mindful of that dynamic, and there are lots of questions about the dynamics between policymakers. We're now all of us are getting trained in how we do this work in a way that respects the time and resource constraints of the people we are engaging with. And we're actually getting quite good at being able to respond really to the policymakers' questions rather than the flip side, and those kind of challenges, rather than the flip side of us descending upon sort of policymakers saying, this is the worst work we're doing, and here's how you've got the problem all wrong, and here's how we know. That's really sort of a story of the past in my experience, and that it's these collaborative ways. They're really mobilizing sort of your knowledge resources around you and across the country to do what is effectively a shared challenge. The researcher, and one of the other questions came up about, what do you get out of this around it as a researcher. It is so exciting as a researcher to do this kind of work, because it becomes real. These things have become real for you, and nothing's more exciting than getting a completely different perspective on your research that you just simply cannot get. For me, as a historian locked away in an archive, a massive transformative moment for me was where I took my disinformation knowledge and expertise out into the real world, testing it against vaccine hesitancy and COVID disinformation. It was so exciting to be working with policymakers around the communications, with data scientists around the big data, the things that I could see. So I think it's a bit of a change dynamic, and I think we're getting good at working within those contexts.
Right. Brilliant. And anybody want to add anything? I mean, I'll just add that, well, first of all, if you are a policymaker and you want to be connected with an academic expertise, in the absence of our brokerage service, just email me or Michelle Reeves or anyone at LRAP, and we've got great networks across London, happy to make those introductions. And also just to reiterate what Joe said, that we, occasionally, in my role at LSE, we do get an email from some of the local authorities sort of beginning to think about one some issue or another, and we're all absolutely thrilled, and it's something we just think this is fantastic, and let's do. And universities do have impact funding. I mean, we have it again at the LSE, which is which academics can apply for. For particular work with communities and policymakers, and it's short term. You can apply for it quite quickly. There's 2 opportunities every year, and I would just encourage London policymakers and policy officers to really contact us and explore how we might get access to that sort of impact funding.
Can I just add something? One of the big challenges that we encountered during the pandemic is that so many people were doing work that was policy facing for the first time. And as we were trying to find the right people to whom to communicate this work, it was very, very difficult. There was a high hurdle to actually find the right people in the policy area who needed to have that information. We knew what sort of generic profile we needed to target, but we didn't know the name of the individual behind that. So it's really difficult if you don't have any prior engagement, if you don't have any prior contacts, to find the right person. And that's where a policy brokerage activity can become really crucial in unlocking those partnerships that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And the crisis showed us one thing, and that is that the speed at which we have to respond is much, much faster than was hitherto the case, and things need to be done extremely quickly. So funders still have to catch up with that. The run-in time for a research project is much too long. But policymakers need to catch up with it as well, and need to realise that the right person to do work with might not be the person that they've been working with for the past 10 years, but might be this new person that they don't know about. So really being open to new partnerships, especially when under pressure, it might save you a lot of time, because you might actually get the right person, and the person who's in exactly the right place to answer that particular question. So again, please reach out to those brokers, because they will be able to help you find that person.
Brilliant. I know we're running out of time, so unless I don't see any more questions, I think I'm going to wind up and give everyone a couple of minutes just to before they go to the next Zoom, in my case anyway. But just to say, I think for those of you from the sort of policy world, you've heard how eloquent our speakers are, and I think I can speak for them all when I say we'd be very happy to come to your or arrange events for your leadership teams and your local authorities or the GLA or anywhere else, just to sort of talk a bit more about this or raise the profile of the sort of offer that humanities can make to policy. So I just want to thank you all for coming. Thanks again to Noel and colleagues for helping organise this. I now realise that each of our speakers has gone the extra mile to be here, denying themselves a walk on Dartmoor or cancelling other meetings or leaving forums early. So thank you so much for that. It was really, 3 really sort of top talks. You can't always expect that. So we're delighted. Thank you very much.